Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday, and welcome to Art School Live with Eric Rhodes, minus Eric Rhodes. I am 𝗘𝗍𝗍𝗃. I'm filling in for Eric this week, and I'm really excited for the show that we have for you today. I have everyone's favorite art educator, Jeff Olson, back. He is going to be talking with us about gouache, and I am super excited because it's my new favorite medium to play with. And since we have to end our broadcast a little early today because we've got another event right after, which I will tell you about later. So I'm going to skip all of the intro stuff and everything, and we are going to jump right in with Jeff. So welcome to Art School Live, 𝗘𝗍𝗍𝗃 and Jeff Olson.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Carrie.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you, and thanks for having me back.
Yes. So for those of you who are just tuning in, we had Jeff here last week, and he was talking to us about all things acrylic, and it was such an amazing presentation that as soon as the show ended, I asked if he would come this week and talk about gouache, because I want to learn as much as I possibly can about gouache because it's my new favorite thing. So without further ado, Jeff, I'm going to just hand everything over to you, and you take it away.
Perfect. Well, since we have a time restriction a little bit today, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the PowerPoint, kind of similar to what we did last week. I'm going to go ahead and bring that up on the screen now. Let me know when you can see it.
Yes, we see it.
All right, we're in good shape. So gouache or gouache, I think that's one of the fun, easy ways to remember how to pronounce it. A lot of folks confuse it with the pronunciation, that is, with another French word, gauche, which means a totally different thing. Tacky, rude, awkward. Now, I have heard some artists use those adjectives to describe gouache. Unfairly, I might add. Gouache is the opaque sister of watercolor, and it offers many rewards to those people who are willing to take the time to woo her. And today, we're going to go over some of the history. Also, we're going to look at composition of the material itself. I'm going to talk about pigments briefly because it's always fun to talk about pigments, right? And then I'm going to share with you some of the specific binders that are used in the making of gouache, what gives it its unique characters. And then we're going to talk about the working properties. So what you can expect working with gouache if you've never used it before, and looking forward to that. And I'm also going to share just a couple images of some of the basic techniques that you can use and some of the fun techniques as well. And then some tips also for having a little more success, especially when you're just starting out. And then I also want to share a bit on acrylic gouache because it's a unique animal in the gouache world. And I want to make sure I share with you what the distinctions are and the benefits of using acrylic gouache if that's something you're interested in. And then, of course, we'll have Q&A as time allows. So let's go ahead and jump right into the history of gouache. So gouache is actually a very old medium. It shares a lot of its history with watercolor. This is an image from an ancient Greek painting done on surfaces called terracotta. And this is an image of Zeus, and it's done with a gouache-like paint. So it wasn't a true gouache yet. They added things like honey and something called 𝗘𝗍𝗃𝗃, which is another type of gum, like gum arabic. It's used in the making of pastels, for example. And so this is some of the earliest form of gouache-like paintings.
I had no idea gouache was this old.
Yeah, it is very old. It's not as old as watercolor or pastel, but it has an ancient tradition. Often you'll see some of these older paintings done with gouache on the museum walls, say opaque watercolor, but they're essentially a gouache. Gouache was a term that came later on. The probably most famous historical references to gouache come from ancient Persian miniatures and Mughal paintings like the one here. Gouache is easier to control, especially the edges of it, than watercolor. So it allows you to get this intricate detail. And if you've ever seen Persian miniatures in person, they are incredibly complex and often only inches in diameter. Wow. Really fascinating, but done with gouache. And again, you'll read the label on the museum wall and it'll say opaque watercolor, but it's a true gouache technique that they were employing. A super great example if you're looking for some historical images of gouache paintings. When we get into the Renaissance, there was use of gouache along with watercolor and inks and illuminations all the way up through the 14th century. And then when we get to the Renaissance, artists like Albrecht Dürer started using gouache in combination with watercolor. You see this wonderful dandelion in the background by Dürer. Often watercolor would be applied first and then gouache afterwards. And you can see the kind of veins in the leaves where he was able to achieve that by putting the more opaque gouache over the top of the watercolor. One of my favorite illustrators of that period was a Dutchman named Joris Hofnagel. Horace Knuckle, probably butchering the pronunciation of that. But he was an interesting character. He was a polymath. He was a merchant, an explorer, a scientist, a mathematician, and a self-taught painter. And he combined gouache and watercolor and gold leaf to create what I think are some of the most dazzling miniatures ever. And this is an example of a painting he did of different insects that he was discovering on his journeys. He's worth looking up. Joris, which is spelled with a J, and then Hofnagel. A really interesting character, but wonderful examples of use of gouache in illustration and scientific illustration specifically. When we get to the 18th century, this is really the heyday of gouache painting, which coincides with the heyday of pastel, especially in France in the 18th century. So gouache and pastel actually were very much partners in crime, if you will, used by many artists of the time. Paintings would be started in gouache and then finished in pastel. You can see gouache kind of family portrait in the background. I love this inset image, though. This is by an artist named Quentin de Latour. He's a French artist from this period. This painting is actually at the Met, I believe. But what's unique about it is he did the whole underpainting in gouache and then finished it in pastel. And it's really amazing. Yeah, they are a natural combination. The surface that gouache creates, that matte surface, has a nice grit to it, and it really picks up the pastel well. So artists are really able to manipulate the pastel over the surface of gouache to this really wonderful effect.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, worth trying if you have pastel around too. They're really a great partner.
Yeah, I never thought of using gouache as the underpainting. I just use pastel and then put the alcohol over it, but I'm going to have to try that.
Yeah, definitely try it. It's a lot of fun. And there are still some artists who are pastel artists primarily today who will do watercolor or gouache underpainting. So it's really a fun technique. We get into the 19th century and artists continued to use gouache. Gouache was a very popular medium as part of the plein air movement that we see with the Impressionists. We have a post-Impressionist image here from Van Gogh, where he's combining it with watercolor and charcoal and other mediums too. And then, of course, the inset image here with Mary Cassatt, where she's combining many materials too. So gouache was very much part of a mixed media palette that artists were using in this period. And I love the Van Gogh, the Cassatt, if you ever get a chance to see some of these mixed media pieces that she did, they're really wonderful in the textures and surface quality that she gets with the gouache too. In the 20th century, gouache was the favored material for designers before the computer came about.
Is that why they call it designer's gouache?
I believe so. I don't know the exact historical reference. We'd have to get a hold of Winsor Newton on that. But I believe the terminology played a role in the folks who were primarily using it in design applications. So if you were an illustrator or a graphic designer in the 50s, for example, you used gouache as your primary medium, especially illustrators. But there were fine artists who were using it as well. Jacob Lawrence is one of my favorite. His is the back image here. It's called The Lovers. He also did the Great Migration series, which is a story of the migration of African Americans from the South to the North in the middle of the 20th century. And they're all painted with gouache on panel. And the gouache really lends itself to this kind of storytelling and these simple abstract shapes that he used. But it was also used by some of the abstract expressionists later in the 50s. It was very convenient, and it gave these oil painters a way to replicate some of the techniques, but being able to do it in a much faster, more rapid process. So we see a lot of examples of some of those abstract expressionist painters using gouache in preliminary studies or small paintings. Then gouache today is as popular as ever. Probably more so than I've seen it in decades. Lots of folks are using it. A lot of contemporary artists are using it. The back image here is David Hockney. The image in the front here is a wonderful portrait by Amy Sherald of, she did this whole series of her neighborhood, people in her neighborhood with gouache. And gouache continues to be translated by this new generation, emphasizing the intrinsic qualities of the material itself, and relating it to contemporary subject matter. And she does such a wonderful job with it. She's the same artist who did Michelle Obama's portrait.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she's a really wonderful painter, worth looking up. But these gouache paintings that she did, they're smaller than her oil paintings, a little more intimate, and they just have tons of character. And they're really just folks in her neighborhood. It's really kind of a fun way to look on your own surroundings, right, for subject.
Yeah.
All right, so let's switch gears here and talk about what is in gouache. If you know what's in watercolor, it's pretty much the same ingredients, but in just different ratios, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But the main ingredients in gouache are pigment and binder. Those are the main ingredients in watercolor as well. And I'm going to talk about the specific binders and pigments here in a minute. Water, of course, is also included in the making of it. And just on a note, the ratios that I'm showing here are just for general use. It's different for every pigment. Not every pigment behaves the same. They have different personalities, if you will. So different amounts of binder, different amounts of water are used, as well as different other ingredients. This is just to kind of give a general idea. Opacifiers are used in the making of gouache. So there are some pigments that are so transparent, you have to add an opacifier, something like calcium carbonate or titanium dioxide. Student grade gouache,
right?
Yeah.
Yellow seems to be pretty transparent.
Exactly. So all those transparent colors, some of those need a little bit of an opacifier to qualify as a gouache. Student grade gouache, they will use opacifiers in every color so they can save on the amount of pigment that they're putting into it. But a true artist quality gouache will not have a lot of opacifiers, if any. It relies on a pigment concentration for its opacity. Dispersants are often used. This helps with the gouache as a kind of a wetting agent. So it's easier to disperse, and flow of the paint is improved. Oxgall is an example of a dispersing agent traditionally and historically. Humectants can be added. Historically, honey. Today, corn syrup is added, and this helps the paint retain moisture. And it's very essential in both watercolors and gouache. And then plasticizers too, like glycerin, prevents it from cracking the paint film and helps the binder to dissolve in water also. So plasticizers can be added. Some other ingredients too, preservatives sometimes, like phenol, are added. Phenol is carbolic acid. It's used in mouthwash and things like that, but it prevents bacterial and mold growth in the paint. So it's very helpful in both watercolor and gouache. So that's the basic ingredients in gouache. So let's talk about pigments. I shared this same image last week. This is how pigment comes to us in the factory, and it's just dazzling to see in person. These bags glow with light. It's super fun. But we classify pigments in 3 different ways, and pigments are universal. So we use the same pigments in making gouache that we use in watercolor, in oils, and acrylics. It's universal across the board. And they come from sources that are either organic, inorganic, or synthetic. Synthetic dominates our palette today, but synthetic pigments have been around for centuries. They start as organic or inorganic pigments, and then we kind of cook them up, and that changes the qualities and working properties of them. And I'll share a couple of examples of each of these. This is probably one more notorious organic pigment. Some folks may recognize it right away. This is the cochineal beetle. In the inset here, responsible for the historical color carmine. Dates back as early as 700 BC in Mesoamerica. So these little bugs are indigenous to Central and South America. They breed on the underside of prickly pear cactus, and they are harvested and have been used to create dyes and pigments since the Aztecs. In the 16th century, when Spain invaded, they adopted this pigment, and it became all the rage as they imported it back to Europe. You see this wonderful painting in the background by Rubens, and this beautiful red bedspread is what it is that his hero is resting on. But it's just an incredible color. It became very popular. It was also a very valuable pigment. English pirate ships were not just raiding Spanish galleons for gold and silver. They were also raiding them for cochineal. And it was a highly valuable, prized pigment throughout Europe. And so it's still used today. Most of the carmine we have in our paints today is a synthetic version, so we're not sacrificing the bugs' lives, but these bugs are still used to create the red color for lipstick, for example.
I'm never buying lipstick again.
Inorganic pigments. So these are the oldest pigments. They're literally the rocks under our feet. Mineral pigments date back to prehistoric times. This is probably one of the more famous of the inorganic pigments. This is ultramarine blue. You can see the source of the original ultramarine in the inset picture. This is a quarry in Afghanistan of lapis lazuli. Lapis is the source for the original ultramarine pigment. It's called ultramarine because the Venetian traders named it that. In Italian, it loosely means from beyond the sea or over the sea. So it spoke to the journey it made from Afghanistan to Venetian ports. Yeah, fun, huh? And it was a super valuable and still is a valuable mineral. It's worth the same as gold by weight and has been even back in the time of the Renaissance. So if you were using this color, you were a pretty successful painter, or at least had a very wealthy patron.
Right? Wow.
Yeah, it's super expensive. It was actually also very symbolically important. The Catholic Church had rules in the Middle Ages of how it could be used. Often it was only allowed in the cloak of the Virgin, for example, and that's the painting in the background here, or the cloak or clothing of Christ. So it became kind of a symbol in a painting that helped people read the most important figures that were in the painting were typically painted in ultramarine blue. That loosened up later on, and by the end of the Renaissance, artists were using it in a variety of different ways. And then finally, synthetic pigments. As I mentioned, most of the colors that we use today are synthesized to make them last longer, have better light fast qualities or better working properties, or be less expensive. Like in ultramarine, we have a synthetic version today that's much less expensive than using lazuli. Yeah. But they are ancient as well. Synthetic pigments are some of the oldest pigments. Last week I talked about lead white. This week I'm sharing probably an even older example, which is Naples yellow. Naples yellow dates all the way back to Sumerian times. Egyptians used it.
Really?
Glass. Yeah, it's super old. Has nothing to do with Naples.
It doesn't.
Nothing to do. The guess for that name, the different answers or stories I've been told is, the English named it that way because it looked like a lot of the stucco in Naples. Some folks say it's because of the sulfur around Mount Vesuvius. So there are different stories of how it got its name. But by the 18th century, it had become incredibly popular with landscape painters, especially. There's an image in the background here by Turner. Naples yellow has this wonderful ability to kind of recede in space where most yellows come forward. Mm-hmm. So it was really popular in oil and watercolor painting of the 18th century and 19th century too for landscape. And it's still a wonderful color, an important color for a lot of painters today.
I've never used it. I'm going to have to see if I can find that.
Yeah, it comes in different hues. Some are a little more red, some are a little more yellow, but it's really fun. And today we have synthetic versions of the synthetic pigment. So the original one was made with lead and antimony. So we don't use that anymore. So most of the Naples that you find today are hues. So they're pigments that are made to look like the original Naples.
Gotcha.
All right, so let's switch to binders now. So binders are super important when talking about the working properties of paint. It's the binder that gives any paint its primary working qualities. So how it behaves on the surface, how fast it dries, all these things relate to the binder. The pigments are universal, remember. The definition, if you look it up in the dictionary, says a liquid substance that hardens through a chemical and physical process. And that is true of most paint binders, but not all. 𝗙𝗏𝘅𝗽𝗍, for example, which is the binder for watercolor and gouache, is actually absorbed into the surface of the paper and doesn't really make a paint film or harden to a crust like that, like oils or acrylics. So not all binders do this, but there are a couple of things that all binders for paint do, and their primary functions are to suspend the pigment. So pigment is like sand, it doesn't dissolve. So if you stirred it up in water, it would all sink back down to the bottom. So a binder, when you stir it up, will hold that pigment in place, and we call that a suspension.
Gotcha.
And then also adhesion. So we want to paint it on a surface, right? It has to stick. So almost all binders are really good adhesives. Some are stronger than others, but they all have this adhesive quality that holds the color onto the surface of what we're painting.
So that explains why pastel falls off, because it doesn't have a ton of binder in it, so it's not adhering to the surface.
Right. It's mostly pigment, so not a lot of glue to hold it to the surface. Exactly right. So what are the gouache binders that you're most likely to encounter today? So the most commonly used binder for gouache is gum arabic, and you can see the little gum arabic crystals here. Gum arabic comes from the acacia tree, one of the oldest living organisms on the planet. The majority of gum arabic that we have today and historically comes from sub-Saharan Africa, countries like Senegal and the Sudan. 𝗙𝗪𝗃 has been traded through European ports from the Middle East and North Africa since the 9th century. That's where it gets its name. European traders called it the gum of the Arabs. Yeah, I can't remember the Arabic name right now. 𝗙𝗲𝗁𝗃𝗵, something like that. But it's got a wonderful history. It's been a binder, an adhesive for archival materials. Most of the 𝗙𝗪𝗃 that's harvested today, right off the live trees, as you can see in the picture, is used in food products. You can't have Coca-Cola without 𝗙𝗪𝗃, for example. And it's used as
this is an organic material that grows on a tree, and they just pluck it off and use it?
Pluck it off, yeah. So it's harvested off of wild acacia trees. They score the branch, and the sap oozes out, and then they pick it off, and you can see those big crystals.
Yeah.
Of sap, and then it gets refined and processed, and then used in a variety of ways.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so that's
no idea.
It's a cool thing. Yeah, I've got some of the crystals in my studio here. It's fun to play around with them, but you can crush them down and create your own binder with them. The other binder that you find a lot in gouache is called dextrin. Dextrin is a type of starch. This dextrin that's used primarily in paint binders comes from potatoes, but it can come from corn as well. It's a generic term, dextrin. You get it from heating these starches up. Yellow starch or yellow dextrins are the most commonly used as binders and also as adhesives. A lot of museum archival adhesives are made from dextrin. Like I was saying earlier, binders are really good adhesives. And it also has a quality of being thixotropic. And what that means is that when it comes out of the tube, and many people may have experienced this, the paint's really thick. But as you start to agitate it with your brush, it loosens up and becomes very fluid. So that's what we mean by thixotropic. So dextrin can be very thixotropic in terms of its handling qualities. Both of these are very good binders. Dextrin is a little less expensive. So you'll find it in some professional gouache, but in a lot of academic gouache uses dextrin rather than 𝗙𝗪𝗃. But they're both equal quality and archival.
So someone just asked, would sap from other kinds of trees work like 𝗙𝗪𝗃, or is it strictly how it comes out of the tree?
There are some others. Yeah, 𝗙𝗪𝗃𝗃, I mentioned that when I was talking about the history, is another gum. It comes from something that's colloquially known as goatweed. 𝗃𝗃 is the Greek word for it. It's a very good gum for binding, and it's used in the making of pastel. But it can be used as a binder for gouache or watercolor too. So there are other types of tree saps that have been used historically. Yeah. All right. So the working properties. So what does this binder do for us, and how specifically is it different from watercolor, which is what I get the most? Like, how is it different? They are sisters. They're basically the same composition, just different ratios. So let's talk a little bit about what you can expect from gouache that's different and the same as watercolor. So convenience, they're both really convenient, right? Gouache, super easy to take with you. It comes in tubes, it comes in pans and portable sets. All you need is water. You can paint on most papers and surfaces with it. It's got, a fairly decent adhesion. Really good for travel, sketching, on the go, as well as studio practice. And you can see somebody kind of painting outside here, having some fun with the composition. But anywhere the inspiration strikes you, you can be painting with gouache. One of the reasons why a lot of oil painters will take gouache with them out into the field for plein air to do studies, because it's just so much easier to work with.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a really important slide. So when we talk about the vibrancy and opacity of gouache compared to watercolor. So a true gouache, a professional gouache, doesn't use opacifiers except in exceptions where the pigment is super transparent. A true gouache has two things that are different than watercolor. The first is pigment size. They have much larger pigment clusters. So a watercolor pigment, can be anywhere around 25, 35 microns. To give you an idea how big that is, a human red blood cell is about 5 microns in diameter. So watercolor gets ground very finely. Gouache is a little bit rougher. It can be like 60 microns. So it's a bigger piece of pigment. The other thing is they just add more of it. So you have this combination of more pigment, larger pigment particle size, and that's what creates the opacity of gouache versus watercolor. And it also gives you really intense color. A lot of folks who just have tried student grade gouaches, everything's kind of tinted with white. A professional gouache or an artist quality gouache is going to have real vibrant color. It isn't going to have that pasty look to it. And that's a significant difference, and why it's worth trying a higher grade or an artist grade of gouache if you've never done it before, to get a feel of what it really looks like and really works. And this also contributes a little bit to the fragility of gouache. Because there is less binder in it, it doesn't adhere as well to the surface. So you need a sturdier paper or panel to paint with gouache than you do with watercolor. It's not as flexible. You can't roll up a gouache painting, for example. You really need to keep it closed in a book or on a panel, because it has so much pigment in it. It's a little more fragile. They are both permeable. So gouache and watercolor both use water as a vehicle. They can be painted into wet surfaces, and after they're dry, they both can be reactivated and lifted. So they're both permeable materials. Even after days, weeks, months, you can go back and add water and lift color and rework gouache on the surface of your painting. Absorbency in paint film. So I mentioned the differences between the pigment loads and binders in gouache and watercolor. Absorbency of watercolor is much better. It actually gets into the surface, absorbs in the surface of the paper, and is going to live there safely. Gouache does not absorb as much into the paper. It rests more on the top, and that's what gives it a paint film. Where watercolor doesn't really have a noticeable paint film, gouache does. It has a very specific type of surface, and that's achieved because of the high pigment ratio, but it's also a little bit more fragile and less absorbent. So something to keep in mind when you're thinking about surfaces. There is a frustrating element to painting with gouache that has to be overcome, and that's color shifts. So watercolor, it's the same wet and dry. The color doesn't change. So when you're deciding on your values and things like that, it's really, straightforward. Gouache has this tendency for light colors to dry darker and dark colors to dry lighter. So you can be painting along, you've got your light values, your dark values, and as they dry, they all kind of come to the middle, and you have this big gray painting.
Yes,
it can be very frustrating. Yeah. So my tip to all the folks who are just starting out is push your values. So if you want an area to be light, paint it a little lighter than you think it should be. If you want it to be dark, paint it a little darker than you think it should be, because as they dry, they're going to come together. And folks who paint with gouache all the time, this just becomes kind of intuitive as they're working. It's kind of like painting with acrylics, where there's a color shift from light to dark. It becomes intuitive and you get used to it. Also, something to keep in mind when you're mixing colors too, you want to mix enough that you don't run out, because it's really tough to mix and match one more time unless you have the exact ratios written down somewhere.
Yeah.
So color shift, keep that in mind when you're working with it, and don't be frustrated. You will overcome it. Dry time and finish. So gouache dries very quickly, just like watercolor. It all depends on how much water you have on the paper or adding to the paint. It can dry within seconds after it's applied. It's definitely dried, 15 to 30 minutes for sure. You can layer it. That also affects the drying time. So the more layers you have, the little longer it's going to take to dry. But they're all really fast drying. And then the finish for gouache is really unique. It's kind of almost a chalky surface. This is one of the things
I love it. I love that
it's
matte look.
really nice. Well, and that's what made it so popular with designers and illustrators. That matte surface made it really easy to photograph without glare. And so that was one of the reasons they preferred it, as well as its vibrant colors. But it has that really fun, unique surface. And because you can layer it and it's opaque, you can go back from dark to light, light to dark as much as you want. And one of the real benefits of the technique using gouache compared to watercolor. Cleanup, super easy, same as watercolors. The binders are organic. There's no harm with gum arabic or dextrin going down the drain. They're in food products. We eat them every day. The only thing you need to be concerned about with cleanup is the same as any other paint, are the pigments you're using. So if you're using carcinogenic pigments like cobalts and cadmiums and these kind of things, then you want to make sure you're keeping your wastewater aside and separating those pigments and not allowing them to go down the drain. But beyond that, cleanup for gouache is super easy. And majority of the gouache colors are non-carcinogenic, non-toxic pigments. So you're pretty safe. There aren't a lot of the carcinogenic pigments used in gouache. And I thought it'd be fun just to share quickly some of the fun techniques that you can get with gouache that are unique. You can get wonderful stains with gouache, and this is different than watercolor. The edges don't bleed as much. Plus, you can layer light over dark, which you can't do with watercolor. So you can get these really wonderful edges and stains with gouache. That's super fun to do. Of course, dry brush is in a very immediate, probably the most basic way to apply to the surface. You can get bold, smooth areas of color. You can let the paint run out of your brush and get this wonderful broken color effect with it. Color mixing, of course, it's well known for. It's still used in a lot of college programs in color theory study. So you can mix a variety of primary, secondary, tertiary colors together. And this wonderful composition by Paul Klee, you can also layer the colors to create some real nuanced effects and layers, light over dark, dark over light. You can paint wet into wet with gouache, like with watercolor, but you get a different effect. It doesn't bloom or bleed in the same way. Yeah, the pigment density is different, but you do get these kind of fun effects, especially on this cold pressed paper. That's this example here. It almost acts like a granulating color would in watercolor, and you get these fun kind of little tendrils and movement, and you drag it around on the surface and really create some fun effects into wet techniques with gouache. Splatter techniques is a fun illustration where the artist has splattered using their brush, the gouache, right onto the surface to create these kind of explosion effects in the background behind the figure. A real fun technique with gouache, especially because of its opacity. It tends to really come forward from the background and kind of float on the surface. Lifting is easily done with gouache because it doesn't absorb as much in the surface. There's really no staining color per se. So it's really easy to lift the color back off the paper, so you can do some fun lifting techniques. This is a fun technique. It's called the resist. So what's done here is they start with gouache and they paint the composition and they leave parts of the paper exposed. And when the gouache is dry, they take black India ink and they cover the entire surface. And then when that is dry, they run it under water and kind of wash it with a paper towel or a sponge, and it washes away everywhere the gouache was at. So the gouache acts as a resist. And so what you have left is this fun image. It almost looks like a print.
Yeah.
So that the ink stains the paper wherever the gouache wasn't, and the gouache lifts, and you get some really fun effects. There are some artists who specialize in this technique alone. It's worth looking up. Yeah, gouache resist, super fun. Kids can do these. Professionals use this technique. It's used in a lot of ways. Some people go back in then and color these with gouache again. So a lot of versatility. Mixed media, we had talked about that through the history of it. Most artists historically have used gouache and mixed media techniques. This is Jamie Wyeth's portrait, or one of his portraits of Nureyev. And he uses here ink, gouache, pastel, charcoal, graphite to create this wonderful kind of expressive quality to this portrait. And I love the way he leaves some of these materials like the white gouache in the background, the brush strokes, we see the edges of it, we see where he scraped into it. It really adds to the surface tension and the tension in the face of the figure. So it's really nice how he exploits the material itself. And then some of my quick tips, start out small scale, 9 by 12 at the largest, till you get a good feel for it before you try to do larger paintings. So small scale is a really great way to get started. Limit your color palette. You don't need a lot of colors. These colors mix secondaries and tertiaries really well. So a primary set with a black and a white is all you really need to get started. So you don't need a big investment, and then you can add colors as you become more comfortable. Use big strokes to block in. So having a good 3/4 inch or 1 inch flat brush is really nice tool for gouache, along with your traditional round brush to block in large areas. It's one thing you can do with gouache that's different than watercolor. Think about your values ahead of time. As I mentioned, there's that shift in value. So you really want to think about the areas you want dark, the areas you want light, and pump those up, exaggerate them because they will dry towards the middle. And then layering, which is a common technique. Wait for the surface to dry. It doesn't take very long. So you can paint wet into wet with these if you're painting very quickly. But if you're outside, it's a dry climate, you're going to find they dry almost immediately anyways. But it's always nice to wait for it to dry, and then you can paint over the surface. The more water you're adding to the mixture, the more it's going to be a wet into wet effect. But if you're painting with gouache just right out of the tube, which you can do, you can layer really easily. Just give it a little chance to dry first and you'll have better results. And then keeping your brushes clean. This is probably a rule for every type of painting medium, but just, especially for gouache too, keep your brushes clean, because a lot of gouache painters have trouble with the paint getting muddy really quickly. So keep your brushes clean, wash them off before you go to each new color. And then acrylic gouache. Before we run out of time, I wanted to make sure that I talked about this because it is a unique creature. It is different from the other gouache in many different ways. It really is an acrylic paint that mimics gouache. So the first is its binder. It uses an acrylic polymer emulsion binder, the same binder that's used in acrylic paint. Mm-hmm. Because of that, it has a lot of the working properties of acrylic versus what a true gouache would do. It is still fast drying. Depending on how much you put on and layering, it can take longer than a traditional gouache to dry, but it does dry pretty quickly. Main difference here from traditional gouache is it's waterproof and permanent when dry. So when acrylic gouache dries, you can't lift it back up. It's waterproof, it's permanent. It's not going to come back up, which is beneficial if you're layering, right? You're not going to have any streaking, so it can be advantageous depending on your technique. It does have a matte finish, although I think it's a little different than the traditional gouache matte finish. There, the acrylic binder is different than the dextrin or the gum arabic. And I've also found that different brands of acrylic gouache have slightly different finishes, so you may need to find the one that you like the best.
Yeah.
But they are still very matte compared to a traditional acrylic paint. They're very strong and flexible paint films. So unlike true gouache, which is very fragile, this is a very durable paint film, which means you can paint on a lot of different surfaces that you wouldn't be able to use traditional gouache with. So it's a little more flexible, literally and figuratively, in terms of using it. You can paint straight from the tube. You don't need to add water to it. There is color shift. It's more like the color shift you get with acrylic, which is the paint is lighter and then dries darker, although there is some shift in the lighter colors towards a darker value too. So some of that same strategy applies with acrylic gouache. And you use water as a vehicle and for cleanup too, just like you would with an acrylic paint or a gouache paint. So, cleanup is really easy. The difference here is you've got that acrylic polymer emulsion, so it's best not to put that down the drain. Better to let that settle in your water, pour off the water, and let that dry and dispose of separately. Mm-hmm. All right, that is it. Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and escape from my presentation, and I can stop sharing here. There we go. I'm back.
So, hi, that was amazing. I loved it. Sarah was messaging me because I'm over here nerding out and like amazed at this stuff. So one thing I did want to touch on is I have tried both gouache and acrylic gouache, and I found that I have to use acrylic gouache because I do some pet portraits. I started using acrylic gouache for the background because I'd paint the background and then I'd start painting the dog. And then it's like, if I messed something up or I put too much water, it would take away the background. Yeah. I was constantly like having to put that back in. And so I started using acrylic gouache for the background. So it was permanent. And then I didn't have to worry about taking it away, but it still had the same look as the gouache that I was using. I do agree that it does have a little bit less of a matte quality than the traditional gouache, but for the most part, I use them together, which was pretty cool. So a couple of questions that we have. Is there a best, like what kind of brushes would you use for gouache? Is there a certain type of hair or synthetic? Like, is there certain things that work better with gouache?
The same brushes that are preferential for watercolor are great for gouache. I love, of course, natural hair fibers, but synthetics today are so good. It's not like 20 years ago. Synthetic brushes or synthetic blends are really great. I like to have at least one flat brush, so something that's a 3/4 inch or an inch, and that's great for blocking in color. And then a nice round brush like a 6 or an 8 is great. Those are really the only two that you need. If you want to have a smaller brush, smaller round brush for detail, or a smaller flat brush to get more variety in strokes, that's great. But as far as the type of brush, your standard watercolor brush works great. You can use oil and acrylic brushes with gouache. They're a little stiffer bristles, of course, so that'll change the appearance of the material, but it certainly would work with them. But I would say the majority of painters who are using gouache are using watercolor brushes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Someone asked, are lake pigments used in gouache? I don't know what lake pigments are.
So lake pigments are a special type of pigment. So alizarin is an example historically. So lake pigments were originally dyes, like madder dye, but they weren't light fast. So they synthesized them with other pigments on another surface. So they kind of dye a more stable pigment. And that is what we refer to as a lake pigment. And, it really depends on the line. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if there's a specific lake pigment that's used in our gouache, and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but there may be, so I'm going to, say there may be some lake pigments on there. Madder lake is one that's pretty common that you'll find out there. Alizarin, not permanent alizarin, but traditional alizarin is a lake pigment. Yeah, you really have to explore it. Different manufacturers, especially Japanese gouache, have a totally different palette than the European manufacturers, and they use some unique pigments. But I'm not certain of that. I'd have to go and check specifically.
Okay. Next question. So what is the best white? And let me rephrase that question because I don't think there's one that's best. There's different types of white. And from what I understand, artists use them for different purposes. So there's titanium and there's zinc, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what would be the purpose of using one over the other?
They're both excellent pigments. Zinc is a little more transparent. So zinc white is really nice for mixing. It allows you to get a little more of that natural hue through. So it's great for tinting color. Titanium white is more opaque. It's stronger. So when you tint with it or mix with it, it tends to dominate. But it is a brighter white and a more opaque white. So it's better for covering. Neither one of them is a bad choice. It's nice to have both, or sometimes you will find colors where they mix the zinc and titanium in the paint itself already and give you kind of a mixing white to work with, which is a nice example too. So both of them are great pigments. They do different things. A lot of oil painters, for example, when they're using gouache, like to have both a transparent white and an opaque white. Allows you to create some different effects. But you can't go wrong either way. It just depends on your personal preference.
Gotcha. So next question, and this is one that I can actually answer because I know the answer to it. So we had several people comment, why bother using acrylic gouache when you could just use acrylic? And I think, or what's the advantage? Why wouldn't you just use acrylic? And I see it less of as an advantage over acrylic and more as an advantage over gouache, because you're getting the permanent quality of acrylic, but you're getting the look of the gouache. I know that's why I use it. Would you agree, or do you have a different thought on that?
Yeah. I mean, it is different than acrylic paint. It doesn't have the same surface texture acrylic gouache. Acrylic gouache was really created to give folks who like the surface look of gouache and the appearance of gouache, but with the convenience of some of the acrylic working properties, specifically the permanence. The same thing you were explaining is why folks like acrylic gouache. When you put it down, it dries, it's permanent. It makes it easier to layer colors one after the other. You can build up more surface. You can paint on more variety of surfaces. So that convenience factor has opened up a new audience to people who like the look of gouache but are intimidated by the process or just don't like the general working properties of a true gouache.
Right. Awesome. Okay, so next question is, and I struggle with this, we talked a little bit about it after last week, is gouache dries really fast, especially here in a dry climate. So can you mix it with mediums like you do with acrylic to extend the drying time? And if so, how do you do that?
It's the acrylic gouache, you definitely could. I mean, it's essentially an acrylic paint, so it would be compatible with other acrylic mediums. Of course, you would be adding more acrylic binder to it. By doing that, it's going to start to behave more like a traditional acrylic paint than it would like an acrylic gouache. So that's something to keep in mind. Gouache itself, the same type of mediums that you would use with watercolor can be used with gouache. Oxgall is a popular thing to mix in. Things like wetting agents. Glycerin is something that you can add to enhance or change the working properties of gouache. But traditionally, most artists, and when I say most, 90-some% of them are simply using water and the paint. The fast drying quality of it is what they're after.
Right.
and the ability to layer it and do quick studies and sketches, one of the strengths of it. But there are some of those types of watercolor mediums that you can use with gouache and experience some of the same things. And also adding water to it alters it too. You can make a more fluid, more transparent effect with gouache by adding more water to it. If you're painting on a wet surface, so you're pre-wetting your paper and then adding a fairly diluted gouache to it, that's going to extend your drying time and your working time. So there are little tricks and hacks you could throw in there for sure.
Yeah. So the other question was about surfaces and what kind of surfaces you can paint on. And what I've come to find is you can paint on pretty much anything if you prepare the surface.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing with gouache is it's a fairly fragile paint film. So once it's on the surface really can't move. So you can't roll up a piece of paper or fold a piece of paper or something like that. Same with the canvas, it would crack and peel off. So you can paint on any type of paper as long as it's heavy enough, something that's 140 pound or more, or mounted to a panel. There are panels that are prepared for watercolor and gouache. Aqua boards, for example, are really nice, and that's a nice, stable, sturdy surface to work on for gouache. Bristol is very commonly used, especially in schools. I know that most class lists for color theory are some gouache and a pad of Bristol, usually plate or vellum, depending on the instructor's preference. But that's usually a harder, sturdier surface. So you just and after it's done, you need to protect it a little bit more. Like a watercolor, it's permeable, so you probably should mount it under glass to present it. You want to keep it flat. So if you're storing gouache paintings, they should be in a flat file or some type of rack. Sandwich between things is really good. A lot of artists keep them in nice sturdy sketchbooks. So you just want to protect that surface from being bent or twisted or moving in any way.
And then, so to that as well, for those people that don't want to frame it under glass, you can varnish it, right?
There are some varnishes that are out there. Just like with pastel, though, there's a slight discoloration that happens when you put the varnish on it or the fixative on it. So be aware of that. You want to test that on something that's not your masterpiece first.
I experienced
how
that.
That looks.
Good.
Yeah. So, be prepared for that. And that is a reason why a lot of artists choose glass instead. They don't want to alter the look, the values, the colors of what they've created by putting a type of varnish on it. But there are some varnishes all the way. There's some gouache varnishes that are through the atomizer. So there's some traditional ones, and you can use some spray-on ones too, and some different types of varnishes. It is permeable surface, so be careful if you're brushing on anything.
Yeah, I experienced that. So I had the artist I was following suggested, so there was you have to do like a permanent varnish on it, which is what I did first. And then you have to put an isolation coat, and that's what makes it, waterproof, so that you hurt the painting underneath. And then you put on your top layer of varnish, and that's the removable layer, so that hundreds of years down the road, if they want to restore your painting, they can. However, I found that when I did that, because I wanted to still have that matte look, I was using a matte varnish. It left streaks from the brush. It wasn't picking up paint or anything. It was just streaking with the brush, and I just did not like it. And I think last time you said that there's a matte varnish spray that we can get, right?
There are some matte varnish sprays. Yeah, mattes, and then there's usually gloss, and there's usually a satin kind of in between. Matte varnishes have a matting agent in it, and sometimes that's what we see in the streaks.
Right.
That matting agent, and that's what reduces the glare reflection off the surface, the matting agents that are in it. And so sometimes that can be an issue, and you do avoid that by using a spray. But again, there's some unpredictability in applying those, so make sure you test it on something.
Awesome. Jeff, this was amazing. I loved it. It was so thoughtful and just instructive and just so educational. It was awesome. I loved it.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming back on and doing this. And for For those of you watching, Jeff is actually going to be doing a talk during Watercolor Live Essentials Day about watercolor and gouache. So be sure to check that out. Watercolor Live is going to be awesome. I am super excited about it. And then the reason we are ending this show early is that we actually have an event with Eric right after this. He is going to be talking about some artist tools that he's created and how those can help you, and answer some questions about that. This all came from our Art Business Mastery Day that we had last week. So if you are interested, hop over there, artbizmastery.com/questions. And please make sure you type biz, B-I-Z, because if you type Art Business Mastery, you're going to get some completely other person. So artbizmastery.com/questions, that's where we're going to be in about 10 minutes. But again, I just want to thank you, Jeff, our favorite art educator, for coming in here and letting us nerd out and talk about art products, because it's my favorite thing to do.
Well, thanks for having me. It's always fun. Always fun.
It's going to be great. And then tune in tomorrow. I actually have a gouache artist from Instagram that I just discovered that I'm going to be bringing in to do a demo, so we can answer more questions about painting with gouache. So be sure to tune in for that. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That way you can always get notified when we go live. And I will see you guys all tomorrow at noon Eastern time, or I'll see you in 10 minutes with Eric. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you again to Jeff. We will see you guys tomorrow.